My right side. All right, everybody, we can get started, I think. Good afternoon to you all. How are things?
All right.
So today's Thursday. We're kind of on to our fourth class. Does anybody have any questions about the material or about how the class is going, just sort of general issues that you want to bring up right now?
I guess for the homework that's due tomorrow, I can't edit Word documents, so I just kind of like copy and pasted all the questions into a Google document and then turned it into a PDF to submit it. Is that okay?
That is great, Alexandra. Okay. That's perfect.
Can also download docx files from Google Drive, so you can submit it as a doc file too.
Cool, thanks.
That is also an option, yeah, and that would work well too. Other questions or concerns as we get going here? Okay, so before I get far into today's lecture, I want to talk a bit about last lecture, and I want to see if we can sort of recall a bit of our previous topics. So the first, like today's lecture and the lecture from Tuesday, covering a lot of material because we're condensing for 2 centuries into just basically 2 class periods. And so that's why this may feel a bit rushed. But the textbook is, it has the material in it, and it does a bit of jumping around, but I think it's got the material that you need. And you can also watch the recorded lecture if you'd like from before. That will help as well. But today we'll talk about this period a bit in a bit more depth. But I want to talk first of all though about a few things from last class. So I'm going to ask you all if you can remember some terms. So if I'm just going to sort of call on somebody, if you could have your cameras on, that I can't see all the faces, that would be great. Let's see. Let me ask Lacey, do you recall what the term Gokaido refers to? Gokaido.
No, I don't know.
Okay. How about Casper?
Not off the top of my head, no.
All right.
Could I answer?
How about some volunteers?
Could I?
See who is asking. I can't quite see yet.
It's Mai.
Mai, yes, Mai. So tell us what is the Gokaido?
I think if my notes are right, it's the 5 roads that they started for the trade routes.
Yeah, right. So this is the road system that was building on some earlier not so great routes, but that really brings together all of Honshu into one relatively well-connected and unified whole. These are maintained by the shogunate. There are torches all along so you can see where you're walking even at night. There are 53 stations to stop at and eat or rest or change horses. It allows information and people to travel in a way that has been up to this point impossible. So that is a Gokaido, very important. Let me also ask you about a bit about Edo. So what is Edo, first of all?
It's the capital city.
Capital city, all right. Does anyone recall what the 2 different sections of Edo are called in English or Japanese? I see Jack's hand. Yeah.
There's the upper and lower city.
Yeah, the upper city or the Yamanote and the lower city or the Shitamachi are the 2 different kinds, parts of the city. And is it Kiara? Can you tell us like what makes the upper city different from the lower city?
I'm sorry, but I was just allowed into this class last night. But
Okay, let me see. How about Alexandra? Can you tell us how these two different parts of Edo are different?
That's not one of the parts I remember. I'm sorry, sir.
That's okay. All right, so I'm just going to sort of remind you that the upper city is. Oh, I see a few hands. Okay, all right. Let's go with Sam. Sam Longwith.
So the upper city is basically like where the shogunate and like the samurai and all the other families from around the country would be. And then the lower city would be more like the merchants and other classes that would live outside.
Okay, very much so, right? So the upper city is the nicer, more luxurious, bigger houses, more beautiful spaces, and less prone to fire, less close to the coast of Tokyo, Tokyo Bay, and it is separated. It's separated from the lower city by the Imperial Palace, which is in the middle. So that's good to remember that as well. So I just wanted to go over a few things and sort of see what you guys are picking up and what you weren't picking up. This has been really good for that. I'm going to go ahead and put the PowerPoint back up again, and we'll start looking at last class. We actually stopped talking about our class stopped at the moment of the Shimabara Rebellion. So I'm going to pick up there again, and we're going to move on from that point forward. Okay. Share screen. Okay. Okay. Yeah, let's do that actually. I have on this. I have again the 6 settlements. And we talked about some of these last class, and I wanted to highlight a few of those. If you'll recall, we talked about this thing called the Sankin Kotai, a very important one of the 6 settlements, and it has to do with why the samurai class, why the daimyo are so broke and unable to rebel. Does anyone have a recollection of what this term is referring to, Sankin Kotai?
Alternate tenants.
Looking for. Yes. Who was that? Sorry, I missed. Who was that?
Oh, that was me. Kenneth.
Okay, thank you for that. So that is indeed the alternate attendant system, and it's crucial to the function of the Tokugawa order. Let's also sort of remember how this is exorbitant in terms of cost, and it's a big production, right? And it's a way that the government can keep an eye on the nobility, and a way in which also their ties to their home domains are weakened. The family stays as hostages, so to speak, in the capital. We also talked about no ships or Christians or foreigners outside Nagasaki. And this was a strange thing since we had been, until this point in the class, talked about foreigners very much. And I talked a bit last class about the arrival of the Jesuits and the Portuguese, and talked about the arrival of European muskets, weapons, and how that changes things. And we also talked about how Christianity was popular, but then it became, it was seen with I think, pretty important suspicion because of the fact that the regent and then after that the shogun were aware of Christianity's ties to colonization that was happening at the hands of Portuguese and Spanish explorers, conquistadors, etc. But I want to move on with this topic some more because it's actually very important. A very small religion has a big impact on Japan, and I want to talk about that a bit more today. we discussed a little bit that there was, Christianity was made illegal, and it was made illegal again, and that the priests were exiled, and that people in Japan had to demonstrate their lack of faith in Christianity. We talked about the ones that resisted in Shimabara, which is down in Kyushu. But the most important thing as we sort of move from this forward is that the shogunate was trying to find ways to pull Japan together. And Christianity, it may have been a risk for some disunity, right, or disloyalty, but the reality is that suppressing Christianity was a really useful tool, in fact, for creating unity. And I want to talk about that next. So Shimabara, again, was the first and the last open rebellion to happen in Tokugawa, Japan. Besides that, we have 2.5 centuries of peace under this very effective central government. In order to make sure that the Japanese were not Christians, the shogunate initiated a series of policies that we call the temple registration system. And this is a system in which every person in Japan had to register at their local Buddhist temple. And this required, if you had a birth, you would go to the temple and you would report it, and they would report it. If you got married, you would do the same thing. When someone died, you would do the same thing. So this creates a really tight loop of information between the Japanese citizenry and the shogunate, all revolving around Buddhist temples. But the goal of this was supposed to be making sure that you weren't a Christian. So you also would have to say, I'm not a Christian, and stamp or stomp on the image of Mary or of Jesus. Now, that's what it's supposed to be about, but I would argue that there are other important benefits the government gets from having the system in place. So take a second and think about this system of compulsory registration at Buddhist temples. And I'd like to ask you as a class, are there some ways in which this could benefit the shogunate to have this system in place? And if you could just raise your hand and also say your name when I call on you, because it's hard to see everyone's at the same time in this particular setup. Naya raised her hand. Okay, Naya, yeah.
Okay, hi. So I think that so making them do this will probably prevent rebellions from happening. I know a lot of the readings, that was one of the main concerns the leadership in Japan had, was that there was going to be rebellion. I remember reading one of the leaders even wanted the Japanese citizens to worship him. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I remembered that specifically.
Yeah, so Hideyoshi did want to have himself remembered very, very well as at least somewhat of a deity, and this sort of trend of worship continues into the shogunate. So how does this system of temple registration avoid how does it help to avoid rebellion? And this can go back to you, Naya, if you want.
I'm sorry, did you say something?
Yeah, I was just asking sort of how does this system help to avoid rebellion?
I thought that well, I guess because it keeps a close watch on the citizens of Japan, and so
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, right. This is a way to keep tabs on the people of Japan, right? To know what they're doing all the time, how many of them there are, if they want to move around, where they're going, who's marrying whom, definitely. Any other benefits that the shogunate might derive from this system? Nam, yes.
Hi. Wait, what's your question? Like, what was the benefit coming from this system?
Yeah, for the shogunate.
I think one of the things that they did was to take power away from the daimyo and concentrate power on shogun. I'm not sure right.
Well, if you can tell me how this does that, then it's right. And it's definitely true. But how does this do that?
Yeah, I forgot. I just forgot. So sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah.
Daniel May has his hand raised, so yes.
I don't know if this was like explained, but like with like preventing Christianity, like Christianity and Buddhism have like a lot of different morals and like ideologies. So by like crushing Christianity and forcing everyone to have like this one religion or like worship one person, it like unites them. Whereas if he like allows Christianity to continue, people have different morals or opinions on how things should be, which can result in like revolution.
Okay, yeah, very good, right? So we're making Buddhism into a sort of a state religion, right? The institution of the temple is the centerpiece of this state religion, and going is mandatory, not for religion, but for everything else. But of course, you go for everything else, and then while you're there, you also are being a Buddhist. So it does create a unity that is very useful. And thinking about ideology, one thing that we haven't talked about, but that you're right about that, and I want to explain, is that when the shogun wanted to pass edicts or put down measures, put them in place about behavior, morality, and conduct, or sometimes new laws, they would have them pasted on the temple bulletin boards, so that when people came and for all their various required temple activities, or their yearly or bi-yearly not a Christian declaration, they would also see all the rules posted from the shogunate. So information from the shogunate was dispersed throughout society through these temples, and it became an instrument of ideological propaganda, if you will, for the state. So that's why I have a question mark next to the anti-Christian measure. Christianity wasn't really the issue here. In reality, as I think Daniel has very well pointed out, this is about control and about power and about influence and ideology. It's also about being able to keep track of how many people there are in Japan. So we have a census taking shape and ideology being diffused as well. So anyway, that was a bit of a long sort of pathway around, but I want to just sort of dwell there for a bit. And here you can see how a very small religion of only a few 100,000 members at its peak, in fact, becomes the keystone for this new system of ideological diffusion and power centralization. If you think back to the list of the 6 elements, no Christians or ships or foreigners out at all, except for this place called Dejima. And Dejima is a man-made island that's just been created off the coast of Nagasaki. And this is where the shogunate has set up a trading post for the Dutch. Now you might ask yourself, who are the Dutch in this story? We talked before about the Portuguese arriving, now they're the Dutch. And to make a long story short, as the shogun became more and more concerned about the designs of the Portuguese and perhaps even the Spanish on expansion and more wary of Christianity, they threw them out. But the money the shogun was making from basically from getting sort of the kickbacks and taxes from all of this silk trade between Japan and China was substantial, and they didn't want to lose that. But the barrier to trade was still present. And so the Dutch proposed, they heard things were not going so well, they proposed to step in and do the trade and to replace the Portuguese. But they promised not to preach Christianity and to follow the rules of Japan. And so they were convincing, and they were able to do this. And so the same year that the Shimabara rebellion takes place and Christianity shows how dangerous it actually could be, is the year that the shogunate agrees to allow this special sequestered island to house Dutch, they call it a Dutch factory, the Dutch trading post, and they carry this trade on. So Dejima it's not part of Japan, it's separate, and there's only one way in and out. It's a very narrow bridge, big enough for maybe 2 or 3 carts, horse-drawn carts. But all the same, it's very important as well. One thing that we often talk about, because Japan's only tie to the West was Dejima, this little island off the coast of Nagasaki that was very heavily controlled and very, there were only a few people there every year, so it's not a big window on the West, so to speak. We called Japan the closed country for a long time because of this policy of being close to the West. But that's not actually accurate. And so I want to highlight that Japan was actually very much involved in international trade, despite this closing of itself to the West. It's very involved with trade in East Asia. So on this slide that you can hopefully see here, I have 3 different important trading partners for Japan. Korea, which at this time is both, it's all the Korean Peninsula. And then the islands that are today called Okinawa, were a kingdom used to be a kingdom called Ryukyu, and Ezo, which is today's Hokkaido. All 3 of these entities have things that Japan wants and have been trading with Japan for a long time. And under the shogunate, the system becomes streamlined, and basically the daimyo will give the right to, the shogun will give the right to a certain daimyo to be in charge of this trade, based mostly on geography and loyalty. So the Seoul house in Tsushima, which is here. Not sure if you can see my cursor or not. The Seoul family runs the trade with Korea. So lots of porcelain, lots of woven goods, lots of hard metals coming from Korea to Japan through this family and making them very wealthy. The Shimazu family down here in Kagoshima are the house of daimyo in charge of the trade with Okinawa, which is with the kingdom of Ryukyu, all this down here. And the Matsumaya house up here are in charge of trade with Hokkaido, with the peoples living up there, who are actually a non-Japanese, ethnically Japanese people called the Ainu. So so Japan is trading with these groups and profiting from these trades, and it's very much sort of an international country, despite it being during this closed country period. Let's skip that and just keep going for the sake of time. So I've already sort of mentioned this before, but this is kind of another way of looking at it. The trade going through Tsushima arrives at Hakata. The trade, mostly from Korea, the trade from China is also going through what today is Kobe, an area called Hyogo. And there are 2 daimyo who are overseeing that trade as well. And I mentioned Shimazu and Matsumae. So each of these daimyo are quite powerful and wealthy and important as well for what they give to the shogunate in terms of tax money, the shogunate's portion of their trade. Okay, so part of how we know that this was happening is because, and how important Japan was in this system, is because we find information on embassies that are being sent to bring tribute to Japan on important occasions, like an imperial accession ceremony when an emperor is named, or an imperial birthday. We see the people from the kingdom of Ryukyu coming all the way, several hundred of them, to Edo to deliver their tribute. This is actually a Chinese system, right, of tribute by lesser countries or lesser empires to be able to trade with them. And what we see is that the Koreans and the Ryukyuans are doing this with Japan as well. So Japan was indeed a very sort of engaged country on the globe, on the at least the regional international scene. This is proof of that. Here we can see the costumes, but these were also very big processions that were watched and were drawn, and people thought they were pretty impressive, and also very un-Japanese. So Dejima, as I mentioned before, back to the one Western outlet for Japan. This is a map of it. As you can see, there's not a lot going on there in terms of space, and there's only a very small egress in and out of this island of sort of sequestered foreigners. But a lot happened there. This little window is in fact what allows Japan to begin to understand the West in more depth than they had before. This happens because there is, on the island of Dejima, there is a Dutch factory physician whose job is to make sure that all of the sailors and merchants who come every year are in good health. But most of the year he doesn't have anything to do, so he would typically do his own research, maybe in botany, or maybe he would be, every few years they would change, but he would be into gardening and botany, or he could be interested in things like biology, those kinds of things. And the Dutch physician would also have lots of books. And so the only kind of knowledge that the Western knowledge that was accessible in Japan was basically housed on the island of Dejima. And because curious, ambitious Japanese knew that, they began after 1650 or so to try and to go to Dejima to learn about the West. They would go to the Dutch factory physician, they would ask for books, ask to learn the language. Initially, this was happening sort of illegally, but over time it becomes legalized. So Western science and medicine are first taught to the Japanese, not by the Jesuits or by Portuguese merchants, but by the Dutch physician who had free time and who was oftentimes willing to share his knowledge with them. The shogunate realizes that this is important and actually then eventually brings the physician to help build an observatory to look at the stars in the sky in 1744. And they also begin to sponsor promising young, intelligent samurai to go study officially with the Dutch physician. And they'll learn Dutch, the language. They'll eventually create the first Japanese-Dutch translation. And the ban on books from the West that had been put in place to prevent Christianity is repealed in 1720. And this is all, again, thanks to this Dutch studies movement. So when you see this term Dutch studies or Rangaku, it is, Japan's first sort of international sort of Western language and culture craze. And it's quite impressive. I mean, can you guys see what this, can you like sort of identify this object in the slide here? What is that?
Microscope?
Microscope, yeah, right. So, it says microscope, and that's what it is. But this is how Japan is taking the knowledge and they're translating it in Japanese and trying to also draw it and then to copy it and, use it as well. This is actually a German book on medicine that was in Dutch, that was translated in Japanese. Can anyone see what's happening here in this part of the image?
An autopsy?
Autopsy, that's right, Danny. So this is becoming more common in Europe at this point, but it's not on every street corner, but it's happening more and more by the 1750s in Europe. But in Japan, it's unheard of to open a dead body. Talked about Shinto and the idea of the pure and the impure, and how it was important to keep them separated and in balance. Touching a cadaver was just not at all a possibility. But the studies students realized that they could learn about the human body a great deal from this very process, and they begin to do that, making big advances in Western medicine in Japan, by the late 1700s. Okay, talked about these things here. I want to talk lastly about ideology. The ideology that we've talked about that is being, sort of heavily emphasized and inculcated in Japanese samurai class, but also throughout society through various means, including the temple bulletin board announcements, is an ideology that I will put up here in a second. But I'm curious if you from the textbook can fill in the blank here on what is the ideology that the samurai are being told they have to study.
Neo-Confucianism.
And who was that? Tell me your name.
Kenneth, the Rick Astley photo.
Okay. Never going to give you up. Okay, so all right. Indeed, this is Neo-Confucianism. This is the ideology of the government. This is the official ideology, and I want to spend some time talking about this ideology for the rest of the class today because it is sort of the glue that holds the shogunate together ideologically. So, this ideology is not a new ideology. The Neo part might be a little bit confusing, but originally this is a Chinese ideology that goes back to Confucius back in the 5th century before the Common Era. And his student Mencius also helped out. And the theories on politics and governance and on morality that have been passed down from Confucius and Mencius over the centuries that emphasize propriety and filial piety or obeying and being loyal to your elders, benevolence. They're very important in China, and they become important in Korea and the Korean kingdoms, and then they become later on important in Japan as well, over the course of several centuries. The kind of Confucianism that's popular in Japan in 1600 is actually based on a movement in the 12th century in the Common Era by Zhu Xi in China, which sought to sort of get back to the original most important components of the text of Confucius, and make it also a sort of a more sort of easier to apply the most important tenets of his thought. So this is the Confucian thought. This is sort of where it comes from, but it takes a while for Japan to get and digest this. But by 1600, the shogun and his top advisor, who we'll talk about in a second, have distilled this ideology down to its sort of barest essentials that are useful for governing in a sort of a central government, strong government style. The first thing I want to mention is the 5 relationships. This is one of the elements that Zhu Xi talks about, and this is one of the things that the ideology of the Edo period, the shogun, emphasizes quite a bit. So there are 5 relationships, and these are that sort of exemplify the right kind of behavior for Japanese samurai, but also for everyone in Japan. The father-child, husband-wife, ruler-subject, friend-to-friend, or sibling-to-sibling relationship. And in each of these, having the right behavior and the right approach is critical. The first 3, as you can see, they all have the same sort of like the same balance of power between the superior and the inferior. And they also have the same sort of responsibility from so the inferior owes respect and loyalty to the superior, the child to the father, or the citizen or subject to the ruler. But the superior also owes benevolence, right, and sort of a kindness and to look out for them, to those who are below. And so this is how society, in theory, should be structured along these principles. And in the household or in the state, these are following these, doing these correctly will lead to a peaceful government. So the Neo-Confucian ideology in the Edo period basically argues that people should follow these rules and be obedient because it will help the state to function better. So you might ask yourself, how does all of this, yeah, who has a question?
Yeah, Alexandra. I was wondering, I had learned that it was
Yes, Alexandra.
parent-child, the dynamic, because the importance of for example, the importance of a wife's husband's family is also super important, like the way that she would interact with her mother-in-law. Is it actually father-child or is it parent-child?
So in Japanese Confucianism, it is father-child, but the importance of the in-laws, like especially for women, the importance of the husband's family is very important. So yeah, but I mean, the character is that for father in most contexts.
Right, thank you. I just didn't know if it was a difference between like Japanese and Chinese Confucianism or if I just didn't understand it.
Yeah, I can look into that a bit more and see if I can figure out like what the difference is. That's a good question. And there are definitely ways in which Japanese Confucianism has taken on its own angle on things. I think I see a hand. Nam? Yeah.
So I was reading the Confucius idea between husband and wife. It sounds really not good for women. Like, how did they? What made them think that the woman would have to submit to a man in family and.
Well, that's quite a long story that I don't even know all the details of, but indeed it is not a relationship of equals. It is one of master to subject, and that's true. I think that the ideology behind that is, it's very misogynistic and sexist, but it comes from a sort of a desire to keep women out of politics, and out of the public sphere. And that was common to China back in the Warring States period, when this was written by Confucius, and it's common throughout Chinese history for the most part, and Japan and Korea both have also adopted that very much as well. Some have argued that men were afraid that women were very powerful, and that they were worried that women could actually take power away from men. Some also worried that that having two equal sort of male female being the same, having the equality in the household, would lead to people not understanding how structure should work beyond the household. So it's important to have hierarchy in the household so you can reproduce it in society. There are lots of theories as to how all this came about, but this is pretty common. I think, if you look at Judeo-Christian ideology, if you look at Confucianism, if you look at many belief systems, this is a pretty common theme that we see, unfortunately. But I'll also mention that not everybody follows these rules, and we'll get to that in a second. Good questions from both of you there. Thank you for those. So the shogun's top advisor was Hayashi Razan, and he was actually the advisor for the first 4 shoguns, and he is a Neo-Confucian ideologue. He believes very strongly that this is how society should function, and that people should really know these rules and abide by them. And his personal private school, Hayashi Academy, actually is transformed into the top sort of college in Japan. So if you were a very intelligent samurai and you wanted to go to sort of high school in your domain, and you did well there, you could then apply to go to the Shoheiko, which was the sort of the top college, the only college in Japan, and where you would learn the ideologies of Neo-Confucianism as they were being sort of interpreted by Hayashi Razan and his family, his descendants. I won't go over the last part, but he was also trying to find ways in which he in which Shinto and the ideologies of Shinto seem to match with the important ideologies of Neo-Confucianism. And he hated Christianity, and he's part of what Christianity was targeted so early on, and he's part of the movement that eventually will create the system of temple registration. Here's a quote from Hayashi Dazan that I think really epitomizes his worldview, so I want us to take a second and just look at that very briefly. Can someone give me like a one sentence or 3 or 4 word summary of what this of the message of this statement?
Yeah, can I say something?
Is that who's speaking? Is that Naya?
Yeah, it's Naya.
Yeah.
So what I took away is that hierarchy is most important.
Okay, so hierarchy is most important, and if you're a Japanese person, a normal subject or citizen, inhabitant, what does that mean for you? Let me see if someone else can help add to that.
It's kind of like saying that the natural order of things is to have like subjects and leaders or noblemen or something like that. So it's just something you have to submit to. It's just the natural way.
Okay, so this is how it is. It's not a choice. You don't choose to stay in your lane. This is how the natural order is. This is how the cosmos is. And so you need to just know that and abide by that, right? So if you are a shoemaker, don't try and become a samurai. That breaks the hierarchy, and it's not your place. It's unnatural. So this is how society should function. You stay in your place, everyone stays in their lane, and the classes, the 4 different classes, each stay in their class, and things will work out for the best. Thanks for that, Wells. So, he's emphasizing 5 relationships. He's emphasizing moral duty, an obligation, a combination of duty and obligation people have, and propriety in his writings, and teaching that to samurai, who then will go back to their home domains and teach others there, but also practice it hopefully amongst other samurai. So back to this pyramid of classes here, that each class should definitely stay in its place. One big concern was that samurai might, who gets their stipend from the government, from the shogunate, might decide to, on the side, to have a farm, or to have a lot of farms perhaps, and to have tenants and make an income that way. And this breaks the hierarchy in that they're not making money, they're making money instead of receiving money to govern. And that's just one of the ways in which Hayashi Nazan wanted to avoid the hierarchy breaking down. Most of Japan at this point is actually the peasantry. More than 8% of Japan was a part of this class, and they had their own organization as well. At the level of the village or the mura, you had the landowners who were the elites, and then you had tenants who didn't own land, and they had to pay part of their crop, usually to the landowners. And then there were heavy taxes that the landlord had to pay to the shogunate. There were sometimes taxes that came out of nowhere. And then there was also the quarterly labor, which was a requirement to do work for the shogunate, including to maintain the great roads that they had. And then at a very local neighborhood level, there were associations of 5 families, gonigumi, which were supposed to sort of mutually observe each other and provide surveillance. Someone had a problem economically, they could look to this five family group for help. But if someone was also not following perhaps the ideals of the government, they could also sort of tell on them and get them in trouble. So this is a way in which the ideals from the government trickle down to even the 5 family unit, to the local citizenship of Japan.
Can I say something really quick?
Let's talk about education. Yes, Angela.
I just wanted to say like how fear really impacts like the peasants, because they made up most of the population, and because they were just so controlled, they couldn't like riot against the governments and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, fear is a big deal. And I think also peasants didn't have it so bad in early modern Japan. There are places where there was serfdom or forms of slavery. I think peasants in Japan were not as bad off as some other places in the world. But they definitely were afraid of the samurai. The samurai who, if as a class, if a peasant did not bow to the samurai as they passed by on the street, they could be killed, and there was no justice for that. That was justice, right? So there was a lot of fear, and this kept them from rioting, from rebelling, too much. But they do occasionally rebel. I can't in this class today talk about that because I don't have enough time. But they do when there's taxes are just crazy and there's too many taxes, they do sometimes rebel. When there is too much corruption, they do sometimes rebel, and they'll attack, the grain stores that are being hoarded by the wealthy. But yeah, fear definitely is a big part of this, and that fear is fed by the ideology also of the Confucian thought as well. So a good point, Angela. Thank you for that. Let's go on to education a little bit here and how that functioned in the Edo period in Tokugawa Japan. Before the shogunate took power, education was a luxury that unless you were in a monastery as a Buddhist monk or a priest, or if you're wealthy and you belong to the samurai class or one of the very few nobles of the imperial family, you could afford to have a tutor and to have books. Those were the only ways you could get education. But the shogunate's time really changes Japan, and they create, first of all, temples. They create domain schools. Every domain has to have a school where the top samurai students will go, and then they go back, and the goal is that they'll be better as officials at running Japan, because the samurai class are actually officials of Japan, right? Despite the fact that they are samurai with swords and such. The same period also sees the rise of temple schools called terakoya, which are just temples that are being used as schools, right? And this is going to allow people of all classes to go to local schools and get the basics of writing and reading down, basic mathematics, and the abacus, so that they can function in daily life. This image here, which actually shows a mixed classroom of boys and girls, you can see that they don't, not everybody is doing what they should be doing. We see a very angry teacher here punishing a student. But the reality is that this really does create for Japan a highly literate society that is able to, picture here of people fooling around doing terakoya, to read very well and to appreciate reading. And that separates Japan from the rest of the world. I think that at this point in time, by 1700, Japan is probably the most literate society on the planet, because of these various kinds of education that are in place. You have novels and gazetteers or local newspapers that are being circulated. You have family encyclopedias, manuals on how to do things, from farming to sex, travel guidebooks that talk about why and where you should go and why you should go there, what things to go see on the way to where you're going, and all these kinds of things. So I want to talk lastly about Haibara Eken. This will be our last thing for today. He is a Neo-Confucian scholar, but who thinks that the ideals of Neo-Confucian can be simplified, and that the average person should be able to read in simple Japanese these kind of the dictates of this ideology. And so he wants to make it more popular and make it a part of the culture, not just elite sort of preserve. So he writes self-help guides to give the Japanese what they need to become better as citizens and to prosper in their daily lives. what you're going to read tonight, if you've done so already, is an excerpt from his, one of his probably most famous book, The Great Learning for Women, which is a text that is meant to tell women what their ideals should be, their goals should be, on how to behave. And so I'd like, I want you to use, your negotiation helmet to think about what he's trying to get across in this text as you discuss them tomorrow with Devin. But think about also where he's coming from, right, and what his goals are, and all that as you respond to the questions on the primary source analysis worksheet. So that's all for today. Any questions before I let you guys go?
I have a question.
Yes, Ashley.
You said that the notes would be on Moodle, but I couldn't find the ones that you did that wasn't for August 27th.
The notes. So the first class, well, okay, so there should be a PowerPoint, right, that's up? Is that what is,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, so the PowerPoint is what I'm putting up. Like, what are you looking for other than the PowerPoint? The class itself should also be up.
Okay.
Sorry, I missed. So I'm going to stop sharing and see, but basically I'm putting up the PowerPoints in the folder for PowerPoints, and then also I'm posting the recorded video when it's ready. It takes a couple of days, but when it's ready, and then that, if you'd like, you can read the closed captions at the bottom of the screen on those. We can do that. If you'd like, you can also get like a Zoom transcript of the text of our meetings, but they're not as good as closed captions. So does that sort of answer your question as to what's available, Ashley?
Thank you.
Yep. All right, other questions before I let you guys go? Okay, so thanks to you all, and have a good afternoon, and I will see you next week, and have a good time tomorrow with Devin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Have a nice.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye. Thanks.
Well, hi, Professor. Like, just in case I was 3 or 4 minutes late, so in case you didn't get my attendance.
Yeah, I think Devin took attendance, so did you get
your
Artemis?
attendance has been recorded.
Oh, okay. Well,
Okay,
thank you.
so all right, thanks. Okay. Youngjin, do you have any questions? Or Nam, are you okay? Okay. All right, Devin. So I'll have a good groups tomorrow, and I will see you on Tuesday.
Alrighty. See you then.
Thanks. Bye.